Now, yesterday there was a shooting in which a former Bernie Sanders supporter shot at Republican congressmen while they were warming up for their annual baseball game. Now, this man, and I'm not going to promote him by saying his name, you probably already know who he is anyway. There's been nonstop cable news coverage of the guy anyway. But basically, he was a 66-year-old man with a record of domestic violence who happened to also be a Sanders supporter and volunteer. Now, he was also a huge critic of Hillary Clinton and the Trump administration. Now, like I said, this guy has a history of getting in trouble, even at one point possessing and firing off firearms at people. Yeah, he literally shot a shotgun at somebody during a domestic dispute. So this guy, this loser, goes to try to kill these Republican congressmen, or I assume he tried to, who are thankfully fine, because look, political differences, we have many. But does that mean that you could shoot at them? Why is that even a question that is entertained? Of course you don't shoot at them. You don't shoot at anybody. Don't shoot people, okay? It doesn't matter how different they are. You don't shoot people. Plain and simple, okay? Now, nobody was killed in that confrontation. However, the shooter later died at the hospital from the shootout with Capitol Police. Now, by the way, if the cops weren't there, if those Capitol Police weren't there, this actually could have been much worse. Ironically, it's because Scalise, who was hit in the hip, was there. Though that was the only reason that these people had protection, or else, in the words of Rand Paul, this would have been a massacre. Yeah, okay, anyway. So after the shooting happens, as we do with all mass shootings, well, we're looking for a motive, right? So we go through, we comb his social media, and we find out, again, that he is a supporter of Bernie Sanders, very vocal one. When that happens, outrage ensues, right? Here comes the right wing first. Violent left, it's Bernie's fault. It's the extreme left with their violent, hateful rhetoric targeting Republicans. Now, Bernie Sanders, of course, as soon as he learned as soon as the news broke that he was a volunteer on Bernie Sanders' campaign, he comes out and makes this very, very strong statement, first in writing, and then he goes on the Senate floor and has to say this.
I have just been informed that the alleged shooter at the Republican baseball practice this morning is someone who apparently volunteered on my presidential campaign. I am sickened by this despicable act, and let me be as clear as I can be. Violence of any kind is unacceptable in our society, and I condemn this action in the strongest possible terms. Real change can only come about through nonviolent action, and anything else runs counter to our most deeply held American values. I know I speak for the entire country in saying that my hopes and prayers are that Representative Scalise, congressional staff, and the Capitol Police officers who were wounded make a quick and full recovery. I also want to thank the Capitol Police for their heroic actions to prevent further harm. Thank you, Madam President.
Okay, so look, that's a pretty strong statement, of course. And look, Bernie's always been for a peaceful, nonviolent change. That's been kind of his whole thing. Bernie Sanders is like a hippie, okay? Always been for peaceful, nonviolent revolution. His political revolution is basically just transforming our society through nonviolent means, through peaceful means, through legislation, through millions of people getting involved in the political process. So, now the shooter, of course, who claimed to be such a big supporter of Bernie Sanders, seemed to have missed the entire point of Bernie Sanders. Flew right over his head. Didn't get it. Now again, his statement, unequivocal, right? Very strong in denouncing this violence. So basically, nobody's going to attack Sanders right over this, right? Wrong. Here comes the establishment, starting with, surprise, surprise, Joy Ann Reid. Now, she responded to a tweet from a Clinton supporter that said, "Too soon to mention Bernie owes his entire political career to the NRA, particularly his support of, in all caps, assault rifles," our opponent decried. Now, first of all, that's not even accurate. Okay, Bernie Sanders, he has a D- from the NRA, and he's voted against so-called assault rifles. And not only that, but when you drill into what happened, the story is actually a lot more nuanced, and her take is completely wrong. But before I give you the details, here's the tweet from Joy-Ann Reid. She said, "I hope we have the maturity as a country to confront facts like this. At the same time, we're thinking of the victims and keeping level heads." Interesting you bring out facts, because I've got some. Now, back in 1990, Bernie Sanders was running for Congress in Vermont. Now, we know that Bernie Sanders, of course, has never been in favor of assault rifles. His opponent, however, Peter Smith, was endorsed by the NRA, originally, of course. Now, Peter Smith, during the course of that campaign, decided to come out in favor of a ban on certain types of assault weapons. Now, the NRA felt 100% betrayed. And they said, well, if you're gonna do that, then you know what I'm gonna do? We're gonna support your opponent just because we want you to lose. We feel so betrayed. We don't care if Bernie Sanders wins. We want Bernie Sanders to win just to screw you over. Pure politics 101, right? Now, some of the people who voted for Sanders in that election did so to teach Peter Smith a lesson. This includes gun shop owner Burke O'Brien, who never voted for Bernie Sanders afterwards. Now, he said, that's the only vote, that's my only pro-Sanders vote that I've ever given in my entire life, and it's to punish Peter Smith for betraying the NRA and betraying gun owners. So the NRA, with their endorsement, he said, an NRA spokesman said, at least Sanders is consistent with his opposition to semi-automatic rifles. That's the NRA saying that. This was, again, nothing more than a political move to destroy Peter Smith. And now, years later, the falsehoods coming out of Hillary Clinton supporters is that he supported assault rifles, and that's why the NRA support him. It's just not backed up by the facts. Remember, these records are from the Burlington Archives, congressional records, and local media reports from the time. So, if you had done some journalism, Joy-Ann Reid, you would actually know this, and you would know the context. You would know what had actually happened, and you would correct. You'd be like, oh, actually, that's not true. I may have my personal disagreements with Bernie Sanders, i.e. on everything he stands for in his politics, but what you're saying is actually not true. He was not supported by the NRA because of his stance on assault rifles. It was a political thing. But again, nuance, right? That's actually being a journalist. But by perpetuating this, Joy-Ann Reid kind of shows us that she's not a journalist, but more of a partisan establishment hack. Now, speaking of people who are not doing journalism, and instead doing hatchet jobs against Bernie Sanders, let's go over to the New York Times. Now, a writer named Yamiche Alcindor yesterday wrote an article in the Times, and in it she writes, but long before the shooting on Wednesday, some of Mr. Sanders' supporters had earned a belligerent reputation for their criticism of Hillary Clinton, the Democratic Party, and others who they believed disagreed with their ideas. Sanders fans, sometimes referred to derogatory as Bernie Bros or Bernie Bots, at times harassed reporters covering Mr. Sanders and flooded social media with angry posts directed at the corporate media, a term often used by the senator. The suspect in a shooting in Virginia put a new spotlight on the rage buried in some quarters of the progressive left. There you go. There's the angry Bernie bro narrative. She goes after him and his supporters. Actually, she goes after his supporters and by extension after him, trying to tie Bernie Sanders' rhetoric of being against the establishment and being against Hillary Clinton, who, by the way, he says, I respect Mrs. Clinton. I have a deep respect for her, but I don't agree with her on the issues. That's his rhetoric. But instead, they're like, no. His fans use terrible rhetoric, and so that's his fault. Really? That's bullshit. That is complete bullshit. Trying to tie Bernie Sanders' rhetoric to this act of violence is just 100% wrong. And it's actually very destructive, because if you want to have a conversation about rhetoric and to be 100% real, I'm actually going to go after my own side. as well as all sides. And look, even I have used rhetoric that is unbecoming, that we could be considered in this context enough for someone to go and attack, for example, a Republican. Okay? Look, let's talk about the narrative against Donald Trump and Russia. Now, look, I'm not defending Donald Trump. I'm not defending Russia at all. Putin is a disgusting human being, and he is a dictator. And Donald Trump is not that far behind on both of those issues. But when you go out and when you say, well, he's a traitor, he's treasonous. Well, look, those are pretty loaded words, right? Considering how this country actually deals with people who are actually treasonous or actually traitors. You know what we do to traitors, right? We kill them. We put them to death. So instead of doing that, which a lot of the so-called resistance is doing, and I see that rhetoric every day. He's treason, traitor. What evidence? You don't really have any evidence to make that specific charge. If you want to say, look, man, he's kind of selling out America in order to make a profit, well, that's different, because that's actually true. Because that's what a lot of Republicans do. But treason, traitor, again, look at the rhetoric. Look how it's loaded. That's why Kathy Griffin was out there with a mock-up of a severed head of Donald Trump. That's how ridiculous the rhetoric has got on the left. Now, on the right, it's even worse, as I'm going to point out. But look, the whole point is, don't talk about violent rhetoric from the other side if you two happen to live in a glass house. Just don't throw those kind of stones if you can't handle the pushback. And again, it has to be mentioned that the right wing are the worst offenders of this. Now, they're not just throwing stones. They've been throwing boulders, okay? And look, just because they can do so, apparently without a lot of pushback, that doesn't mean the left needs to join in. But some people, of course, unfortunately can't seem to help it when it serves the political narrative. In this case, that narrative against Bernie Sanders. And that's true of the New York Times, Joanne Reed, and all the right-wingers that are out there blaming both Bernie Sanders and the left for this shooting, instead of actually looking for the real causes and the real solutions. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more like this, please hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to support truly independent progressive media, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/TYTNation.